There is a city beneath Naples, not a metaphor, not a legend dressed up as history, an actual city. Corridors cut through volcanic rock that stretch for kilometers beneath the streets. Cisterns the size of cathedral naves, still holding the memory of water. Air raid shelters that still have the handwriting of frightened people on their walls. Ancient Greek quarries that became Roman reservoirs, that became medieval escape routes, that became wartime bunkers. All of it sitting directly underneath one of the most densely populated cities in Europe. Most people walk above it without a second thought. Naples is loud, chaotic, beautiful in ways that are hard to explain to someone who has never been. The streets are narrow and close. The buildings lean toward each other like they are sharing secrets, and the energy of the city hits you before you have even stepped off the train. It does not feel like a city that is hiding anything. It feels like a city that puts everything on display, or the laundry lines across alleyways, the noise, the food, the arguments, the laughter. But beneath the cobblestones, beneath the foundations of the churches and the palazzos and the apartment buildings where people are cooking dinner right now, there is another version of Naples entirely. And it has been there longer than anyone fully understands. The rock beneath the city is called tufa, soft, volcanic, yellowish, easy to cut, easy to shape. When Greek settlers arrived in this region around the 7th century BCE, founding what would eventually become the city known as Neapolis, the new city, they discovered that this rock was not only buildable, but workable in ways that most terrain simply is not. You could carve into it, you could dig, you could hollow out chambers beneath the earth without the walls collapsing on you, so they did. They began cutting stone from below the ground, pulling it up to build the city above. And as they pulled the stone out, they left behind something they had not entirely planned. A growing network of empty space under the city. Corridors, rooms, passages. A negative image of the buildings being raised above. They were not initially thinking about what to do with these spaces. They were thinking about getting the stone to the surface. But they are also practical people, and empty underground space does not stay empty for long. The Greeks began using those chambers as cisterns. Naples sits in a dry part of southern Italy, where summer water supply has always been a problem. And those underground cavities could hold enormous amounts of rainwater and spring water, channeled in through carefully cut aqueduct channels and distributed back up to the surface through wells. It was, for its time, an extraordinary piece of infrastructure. It served the city for generations. And then the Romans arrived, and they made it bigger. Roman engineering in Naples is not as famous as Roman engineering in Rome. The Colosseum gets the attention, the aqueducts of Segovia, the forums and the triumphal arches. But beneath Naples, the Romans expanded what the Greeks had started and turned it into something that was genuinely immense. The underground water system grew, new channels were cut, new cisterns were connected to older ones. The tufa rock below the city became a kind of three-dimensional map of the civilization operating above it. Practical, systematic, quietly enormous. At the height of this system, somewhere in the region of 1,000 wells were sunk through the floors of Naples down into the cisterns below. The city was, in a sense, floating on a thin layer of volcanic stone above a vast, dark, waterlogged underground. If you stood in one of those cisterns during a heavy rainfall and looked up, you could see shafts of gray light falling from the well mouths above, dozens of them, cutting through the darkness like pale columns reaching down from the city above. This is where the story gets difficult to follow in a single line, because what happened to the underground network of Naples over the next 2,000 years is not a clean narrative. It is a layering, a slow accumulation. Each century added something, and not everything from the previous century was removed. After the Roman period, the cisterns continued to be used, though the empire maintaining them gradually ceased to function. Medieval Naples grew on top of Roman Naples, which had grown on top of Greek Naples, and each version of the city found new purposes for the spaces below. Some cisterns fell into disuse and were forgotten. Others were converted into cellars, storage areas, escape routes, hiding places. The tunnels and passages that connected chambers to each other became useful in ways their original builders never imagined. And this is where the official history begins to feel incomplete. There are stories from the medieval period, and they are stories, it should be said, not confirmed records of the underground spaces beneath Naples being used for purposes that the daylight city would prefer not to acknowledge. Plague victims, some accounts claim, were moved through the tunnels during outbreaks, away from the streets, and out of sight of the living. Bodies, according to some local traditions, were sometimes disposed of in the deeper chambers. Whether these accounts are strictly accurate or are the kind of dark folklore that tends to accumulate around underground spaces, it is difficult to say with certainty. What is clear is that the underground city had, by the medieval period, taken on a character that was significantly different from its origins as a practical water supply system. The rock itself seemed to absorb the history, layer after layer, century after century. What changed the underground network most dramatically was not war or plague or engineering. It was a problem that seems almost mundane compared to everything else. Cholera. In the 19th century, Naples was hit by repeated cholera outbreaks, and they were devastating. The city was densely packed, poorly sanitized, and the water supply system, which still relied in many areas on those ancient underground cisterns, was a perfect vector for the spread of waterborne disease. The cisterns that had served the city for 2 millennia were now killing it. After a particularly catastrophic outbreak in 1884, the decision was made to build a new water supply infrastructure for Naples, and the ancient underground cisterns were taken out of service. The wells were sealed, the channels were closed. The vast underground water system, which had been in continuous use since the Greek period, was simply shut off, and then largely it was forgotten. For decades, the underground city existed but was not discussed, not mapped, not explored. Above ground, Naples continued to grow. Buildings were built, new streets were laid, the city expanded and contracted and was rebuilt after the Second World War, when American and German forces both left their marks on the city in ways that are still visible today. But below the streets, in the sealed darkness of the old cisterns, nothing changed. The spaces sat, empty mostly, dark, still. What they found when people finally began to go back down was something strange enough to stop you in your tracks. The cisterns were not empty in the way that abandoned spaces usually are, because the underground tunnels had been used across so many centuries, and because Naples is a city where things pile up rather than disappear. The chambers were filled with a compressed record of the city's history. Objects from different centuries sitting alongside each other without any particular order. Amphorae from the ancient period next to medieval pottery. Early modern rubbish beside tools that are centuries older. At some points, the layers of sediment and debris on the floors of the chambers are several meters deep, and each meter represents a different era. Archaeologists who have worked in the underground tunnels describe it as excavating time rather than space. You are not moving through a site that was used in one period and then abandoned. You are moving through something that was continuously inhabited, continuously altered, continuously added to for over 2,000 years. The challenge is not finding things. The challenge is understanding the relationship between them. Some chambers have been explored. Some have been open to visitors through organizations dedicated to mapping and preserving the underground network. The most well-known of these efforts has given thousands of people the opportunity to walk beneath Naples and understand, in a very direct and physical way, what lies beneath the city they are standing on. But some chambers are still sealed. Some passages have collapsed at some point during the centuries and have not been reopened. Some areas are considered structurally too unstable to enter safely, and some parts of the underground network have not been found yet, or rather their existence is suspected based on historical records and the logic of how the ancient water system was constructed, but they have not been physically located. The map of the underground Naples is still being drawn, and even today some parts of this underground world remain difficult to explain. There are chambers that do not fit cleanly into the narrative of cisterns and water channels, spaces that seem to have been modified in ways that suggest purposes beyond water storage, though what those purposes were is not always clear. Inscriptions in the rock that have not been fully translated or dated. Passages that lead to other passages and then stop at walls that appear to have been deliberately sealed from the inside. The Second World War added its own chapter to this history. When the Allied bombing campaigns targeted Naples in 1943, the civilian population needed shelter, and the ancient underground spaces beneath the city became, once again, urgently practical. The cisterns were reopened, some that had been sealed for decades, and equipped as air raid shelters. Benches were carved into the walls. Ventilation shafts were created. In some chambers, small niches were cut for candles. People spent nights underground, listening to the sounds of the city above them being destroyed. Some of those people left traces. There are sections of the underground network where the walls are still marked with the names and dates that sheltering families scratched into the tufa during the bombing raids. Children's handprints pressed into the soft rock. Messages to other families, directions to other chambers, small prayers. They were carved quickly, without any intention of permanence, by people who were frightened and trying to orient themselves in the dark. And yet, they have lasted 80 years. They are still there, pressed into the walls of the ancient Greek cisterns, surrounded by Roman carvings and medieval modifications, and layers of sediment that go back further than anyone can accurately date. That compression is what makes the underground Naples different from most underground spaces. It is not a ruin. It is not a single historical site from a specific period. It is a continuous document of human presence across centuries, written in rock, water, debris, and whatever people left behind when they came down out of the sunlight and into the dark. Above ground, Naples is always being rebuilt, always being repaired, always changing. The city has been through eruptions, earthquakes, wars, occupations, epidemics, and economic collapse, and it keeps rearranging itself, keeps tearing down and replacing, keeps layering new architecture over old. The surface of Naples is a city in perpetual motion. Below it, time moves differently. In the cisterns, the air is cool and constant regardless of the season. The walls are smooth in places where millions of gallons of water once pressed against the tufa and left their mark. In other places, the rock is rough and immediate, the marks of the original cutting tools still visible in the stone as if the workers put down their tools last week. Thin columns of rock, left by the Greek quarry workers to support the ceilings above, still stand in the larger chambers like the pillars of a flooded temple. In the older sections, the walls are stained with a specific mineral deposit left by centuries of standing water, a color somewhere between amber and rust that you don't see anywhere on the surface. Some researchers believe there are sections of the network that connect to spaces even deeper than the main cistern level. The geology beneath Naples is not a single flat layer of tufa, but a more complex structure, and there are accounts from the early mapping expeditions of passages that descend below the primary underground level into something older and less understood. Whether those accounts represent a genuinely separate underground layer or are the result of confusion during chaotic early explorations is something archaeologists have debated without reaching a firm conclusion. What is not debated is that the underground network of Naples is one of the most historically significant underground spaces in Europe. not because it contains a single dramatic discovery, not because it is the site of one particular event, but because it has been in use in one form or another since the ancient world and has absorbed that entire history into its walls. There is something about that which is hard to articulate, but easy to feel when you are standing in one of those chambers. The tufa is close around you. The ceiling is low. The corridor ahead disappears into a section of shadow that your light does not quite reach. And you are aware with the specific kind of awareness that underground places produce in people, that the ground above you is not abstract. It is there. It is heavy. And the space you are occupying has been carved out of it, and maintained, and used, and forgotten, and rediscovered across a span of time that makes the history you learned in school feel like a brief footnote. The city above does not know you are here. That is perhaps the strangest part of the underground Naples. Not the ancient cisterns, not the Roman engineering, not the wartime shelters, not the sealed passages and the unanswered questions. The strangest part is the simple fact of it, that you can be standing beneath a street corner where a fruit seller is setting up his stall, beneath a family eating lunch, on the third floor of a building that is itself 300 years old, and the world above is completely unaware of the world below. The wells are sealed, the cisterns are dark, the handprints are still pressed into the rock, and the city goes on living directly above it with no idea what is underneath.